Geneva, January 2009. We're at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Today, delegates from all countries will be arriving for a negotiation that looks strained. We are the only TV crew to have requested a filming authorization. Sword fights are taking place in this room around a text on racism. Negotiations are at a standstill, and the tone is about to become aggressive. Obviously, our filming irritated some delegates. The Nigerian representative asks for permission to speak.
I know that this may not be very popular, but when did we start using cameras and photographers and taping in the working group, informal working group of the UN system? I'm just asking aloud because
We are fully accredited, and since this is a public meeting of the Human Rights Council, we keep filming. But surprisingly, the chairman yields.
The filming should be stopped.
Our cameraman packs the camera up, but it's still filming. The delegate of the Czech Republic, which presides over the European Union, raises her sign. She wants an explanation from the chairman.
We are somewhat surprised by your rapid decision to ask the journalists to leave the room immediately. We certainly very much wish the journalists to have the possibility to follow what we are deliberating here. It's issues of fundamental importance.
Why are we forbidden to film? What are these tensions between nations that some would rather keep secret? We are about to tell you about an actual battle. This is a war with words on which our rights and freedoms depend. Because in this enclosure, some would like to crush human rights. Why are we forbidden to film a meeting against racism? It's important to understand that behind those windows, the revenge of a battle that turned very sour in 2001 is taking place. Durban, the first World Conference against racism, took place in this South African city in 2001. We were there, and we had film. It had all started so well, 10 years after the end of the apartheid. We went there and we wanted to dream of a world where this victory over racism would enunciate others. We had taken part in a workshop on slavery where American activists were demanding compensations. We had met Tibetans campaigning for their right to self-determination. We had interviewed an Indian activist who came to plead the cause of the 300 million untouchables. We had demonstrated with indigenous people, together with Nobel Peace Prize laureate Rigoberta Menchú. This man with a strange hat is a Sindh, member of a persecuted minority in Pakistan.
We feel it is occupied by Pakistan, and we are indigenous peoples. We are struggling from the last 54 years against the racist government of Pakistan, and that is the reason that I am in exile.
All these demands were quickly brushed out, and the good-hearted atmosphere disappeared. Israel, depicted as the new country of apartheid, became the single obsession on the streets and on the banners. The second Intifada had begun a few weeks before. South African radicals, joined by extremists from other countries, decided to turn the conference into a tribune to lump together Zionism and racism, Israel and Nazism. In the general turmoil, we met strange rabbis, the Neturei Karta. These Jewish extremists opposed the existence of the State of Israel for religious reasons. They were accredited by an Islamist organization headed by Masoud Shatjir.
Give all my phone to...
Yes, we're happy with
the support of Russia because Zionism is an evil and inherently racist ideology and needs to be removed from our society.
But the escalation went way further than that. Anti-Semitic propaganda circulated throughout the conference and on the stands. Here, for example, on the stand of the Arab Lawyers Union, one could buy the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a book depicting a supposed worldwide Jewish plot. One could also admire a competition of very dubious anti-Israeli cartoons. Hook-nosed Jews, Stars of David with swastika, and this pamphlet, had Hitler won, no Palestinian blood would have been shed. Racist words at a conference against racism. Two Belgian activists whom we had met at the Youth Forum are still astonished. We were shocked because as soon as we had set foot in the Youth Forum, we got into trouble. We were labeled as pro-Israeli Jewesses. We had a table with pamphlets and pictures, and then this happened. We were 20 people behind the table, with 30 policemen protecting us, and 100 pro-Palestinian people in front of us shouting, "Intifada, you are murderers, you are murderers." And we had come there with a totally pacifist message saying give peace a chance. We were trying to promote dialogue, handing out flowers. It was really tough for us, and on an emotional level as well. We had never experienced such anti-Semitism before. Underlying anti-Semitism, sometimes in Belgium, yes. Such pamphlets, I had never seen that before. That was our experience at Durban. Conferences against racism are great, aren't they? At the States Conference, the negotiation became so tense that it turned into a dialogue of the death. Some countries walked out, closing the door. A declaration against racism was eventually adopted, but it still does not have unanimous support. 9 years later, this controversial declaration is to be negotiated again in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. What is the current balance of power? That's what we wanted to know before we were forbidden to film. On the following day, embarrassed UN officials apologized to us. They opened their doors and allowed us to search their archives and watch images filmed by the UN cameras during the last 5 years. Listen carefully. Human rights predators go unleashed.
Whenever the EU speaks, it is not so difficult to see the ugly head of Britain, the former colonial master.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful.
Nobody in this council is in a position to decide if Moses, peace be upon him, really split the sea or not.
We appreciate the effort made by China in recent years to continue to promote democracy and the rule of law, including the system of re-education through labor.
Para los que agreden a Cuba y para sus cómplices, tenemos otro mensaje. Patria o muerte, venceremos.
When democracies answer back, actual sword fights happen. Here is an example between an American and a Chinese delegate in March 2008, a few days after the violent crushing down of riots in Tibet. The United States decided to stand up.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States government and the American people are deeply troubled by the reports in recent weeks of violence, arrests, and loss of life stemming from what began as peaceful protests in Lhasa. We are also concerned by the lack of objective, on-the-ground reporting from Tibetan areas due to the government's refusal to allow access.
This noise that you have just heard is the President's hammer. China has requested the permission to speak.
Mr. President. Mr. President, through you, I kindly request you to remind the distinguished speaker at hand to concentrate on the item at hand. Thank you, Mr. President.
Australia tries again.
We are saddened by the tragic loss of life that has occurred recently in Tibet and remain deeply concerned. We would urge restraint and respect for human rights by all parties and encourage early resumption of constructive and meaningful dialogue. We urge China to allow free access to Tibet and other affected areas so the international community and foreign media may gain an accurate understanding of what is occurring there.
The Human Rights Council is a strange place. Not all countries have the right to vote, but all can speak equally. The most democratic countries have a seat next to the worst dictatorships, which often get the last word. Today, the UN is financed as high as 90% by democratic countries and turns into a propaganda machine that serves authoritarian countries.
Encore démocratique pour une machine de propagande qui sert une majorité de pays autoritaires.
A minority of democracies in a weak position? It's not always been the case. To understand this reversal, it's necessary to go back on history. The original mission of this institution was to implement the Universal Declaration and to protect human rights. This ideal stemmed from the failure of the nations against Nazism. In 1933, Goebbels defied the nations here in Geneva. When answering a journalist's question on the ongoing persecutions against Jews, the Nazi official said, "A man's house is his castle." In clear terms, he meant that the Nazis wanted to persecute freely within their borders, and the nations were contented with that. A few years later, Europe had been brought to shambles. Facing the horror of concentration camps, facing the racism that had led to the Holocaust, there was a universal realization. When the nightmare ended, the United Nations were born. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was put in charge of a historical mission, drafting a universal declaration to guarantee the rights of everyone.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. We hope that
the drafters came from all continents. René Cassin, a Frenchman, but also a Chinese, a Russian, a Lebanese. A young diplomat of the time recalls extraordinary debates. The ambience of these years, between the beginning of 1946 and the end of 1948, was extraordinarily ambitious. There have been very few such ambiences in recent history. It was a very grand design, and in order to reach it, slight differences and discrepancies were simply dismissed.
Attablé à réussir ce dessin, les petites différences, les petites divergences ne comptaient pas.
On the adoption
The text crafted by the drafters was simply revolutionary. Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 4. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture. Article 19. Everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. The declaration was adopted in Paris on December 10, 1948. No country dared to vote against, but there were 8 abstentions. South Africa, because of the equality between all men, Saudi Arabia, because of the equality between men and women, and the Soviet bloc states, because of the Cold War, which was beginning. In Moscow, these liberties were pictured as imperialist and bourgeois. But to keep up the appearances, the Soviet Union promised to respect human rights. In 1975, the USSR signed the Helsinki Accords, a pledge on paper which turned into a trap for the Soviets. At that time, what happened in Helsinki was viewed as a formality, just one more declaration without importance. People thought there has been a small reference to human rights and business will go on as usual. No, actually it proved to be a very powerful weapon for dissidents within the Soviet Union. Opponents to the Soviet dictatorship shall then use every word conceded by the USSR to the United Nations to force the Soviets to confront their contradictions. Governments may well lock themselves up. The desire of people for freedom is universal, as are these men and women who cross barbed fences to go west. This freedom, carried by the strength of the declaration, impacts everything: colonization, apartheid, and even the Berlin Wall. Admirers of human rights celebrated their victory. But the bright interval won't last. A new storm is coming. On 9/11, America was hit, but the way the Bush administration replied has been worse than the evil itself. Preemptive war in Iraq, regardless of the United Nations, secret prisons, torture, the USA, which had been the incarnation of human rights since its victory against Nazism, lost its world's policeman stripes. One can't say enough the extent of the damage caused by Guantanamo to human rights, way beyond its actual victims. The betrayal of its values by George Bush's America has been the pretext for which all rogue states were hoping. The pretext to dismiss human rights and lecture democracies. The man who shakes his head is the Cuban delegate. Cuba is a dictatorship which persecutes political opponents and sexual and religious minorities. Yet today, the delegate to the Human Rights Council is all smiles. He has gained victory over this woman, Christine Chanet. She is a UN expert in charge of inquiring the human rights condition in Cuba. Not only has the castrist regime always kept her out, but the delegate takes the liberty to lecture her. Instead of inquiring about Cuba, the special rapporteur would be better inspired to support us in our struggle to close the concentration camp in Guantanamo, in order to put an end to the torture of hundreds of this territory illegally occupied by the United States Naval Base.
En el territorio ilegalmente ocupado por la base naval estadounidense en Guantánamo. Podría también sumar su voz.
The USA, which are repeatedly accused, prefer not to attend meetings. Hence, their adversaries have taken a prominent place. The balance of power has shifted greatly since the adoption of the Universal Declaration. The number of countries in the UN has been multiplied by 4. Most of these new countries are hostile to the United States, and they act as a bloc. 3 groups called the Tune in the Assembly. The Non-Aligned Movement, which comprises Cuba and China, represents 115 countries. The Islamic group represents 15 countries, and the African Union 53. At first sight, a country such as Senegal has very little in common with Gaddafi's Libya, a dictatorship which is known for its racism towards black people and a willing sponsor of terrorism. But the principle of blocs is to remain united, and the moderate countries yield to dictatorships.
السيد الرئيس.
Presidency was due to Africa in 2003. Surprise.
Toujours à l'étranger, ça n'est pas une farce. La Libye a été élue à la présidence de la Commission des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies. Et voici celle qui occupera le fauteuil, Najat Al-Hadjaji, ancienne journaliste. Les États-Unis, mais aussi un grand nombre d'ONG ont fait part de leur consternation.
The first sitting isn't going to reassure them. It begins with a prayer.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
That was too much. A reform was tried, but it did not succeed in balancing the powers. Democracies were even more in a position of minority. On the inauguration day of the new council, the Cuban foreign minister savors his hold-up.
Excelencias.
Excellencies, today is a particularly symbolic day. Cuba is a founding member of the Human Rights Council, and the United States is not. Cuba was elected, was elected with the overwhelming support of 135 countries. The absence of the United States is the defeat of lies. It is the moral punishment for the arrogance of an empire.
Cuba resultó elegida con el apoyo abrumador de 135 países, más de 2/3. La ausencia de Estados Unidos es la derrota de la mentira, es el castigo moral a la arrogancia de un imperio.
The adversaries of America are having their triumph. Yet, most are not democracies. Their revenge will stampede on the human rights. February 2009. A greater than usual crowd is queuing outside. People came to watch an exceptional event, China's major oral exam. This is one of the positive aspects of the reform, which is widely acknowledged. From now on, all countries, without exception, have to present a report on their human rights condition. And that's groundbreaking for China. China holds the record for death sentences. Political opponents are sent to forced labor camps. There is no freedom of the press, and religious freedom is closed watch. In the rows, NGO activists are eager to hear the Chinese ambassador, but at the platform, all for the best and the best of all possible worlds. Mr. President, the Chinese government is firmly committed to the promotion and protection of human rights. We take your support and understanding as a sign of encouragement to China, and your questions and recommendations as a sign of interest and concern. We'd like to enhance the cooperation and exchanges with all countries on the basis of equality and respect in a common effort to advance the cause of human rights. Thank you, Mr. President. Now democracies are crossing swords and asking contentious questions. Mr. President, NGOs have pointed out at the frequent use of detention modes such as internment, house arrest, secret prisons, and labor camps. Are there any projects of reform in that manner? Germany recommends to guarantee all citizens of China, including all its minorities, communities, and religions, the exercise of religious freedom of belief and the freedom of worship. Thank you. However, other countries, less democratic but more numerous, stand up for China. Mr. President, we are dealing with an exceptional country, the millennium-long history of the country and its hard work. Without a doubt, the African Union deserves the prize for flattery.
Han derrotado en el tiempo a todos los que han tratado de someter a ese gran país.
Through my voice, Gabon wishes the warmest welcome to the Chinese delegation, which has committed a brilliant presentation of the human rights condition in China. Please let me use this opportunity to thank China for the many actions that they have taken towards my country since our independence in 1960. My delegation further commends the People's Republic of China's socio-economic, political, technical, and cultural progress and achievements in the field of human rights, including, among others, the development of freedoms of speech, opinion expression, thinking. The farce which you have just witnessed is the plague of the Council. These quid pro quos aren't really related to the human rights situation in China, but they are clearly related to the economic and ideological ties between China and these countries. The sitting is closed. China has 2 days to consider the recommendations and present its final report. D-Day. We are at the Council's cafeteria. NGOs can't wait to hear the verdict. This young woman on the phone is Julie de Rivero. She is an activist with Human Rights Watch, an organization that fights for the victims of the Chinese repression. At the cyber cafe, this man who is sending emails is Nagwang Chapel. He is a Tibetan activist in exile in Geneva. It's a little over 2 p.m. and the sitting is about to resume. The Chinese delegation stands up. They pass a Tibetan activist who is known to defend China during the sittings. No glances and no incident. Julie and Nagwang meet and enter the room. Inside, they acquaint themselves with the report. No more suspense. China has conceded anything, or almost.
Independence of the judiciary. So nothing about access to Tibet, right? Or cultural, religious rights, nothing, right? The whole thing, yeah.
Nagwang is disappointed, and he won't be comforted by what he hears in his earphone. The Chinese delegation is very satisfied. They openly advocate custom-tailored human rights.
Nous estimons vraiment, c'est qu'il faut trouver des modèles de développement de démocratie qui conviennent à nos circonstances.
Apparently, these circumstances justify human rights violation. At the exit, we are looking for the members of the Chinese delegation. They look relieved. Maybe they did fear somehow this presentation.
Excuse me? Excuse me? Are you a member of the China delegation?
Yes, the China delegation.
I would like to have I am a French journalist, and I would love to interview the Mr. Ambassador or someone who can speak.
My delegation has a spokesperson.
Yes, but to do an interview, just to explain the report to the journalist, it's absolutely impossible to ask you.
The power of the United Nations doesn't extend further. One may find this process absurd, but there is no other way to force a major power on the way of human rights, save blackmail or war. By coming here, China accepts the principle of being scrutinized. Without the United Nations, China wouldn't even need to pretend abiding by the Universal Declaration, each word of which is a weapon for the dissidents. We're now going to tell you about the battle led by certain countries against the Universal Declaration. In order to win, they have found an almighty weapon, God. There's a major winner in this battle.
Islam will not be crucified in this council.
Since the reform, Islamic countries have had almost a third of the seats in the council, and they speak in one voice, that of the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, an organization founded in 1969 to stand together on Middle East matters and to promote the image of Islam.
And understandings among these communities as well as...
This initiative came from a country which has never signed the Universal Declaration, Saudi Arabia. In 1990, Islamic countries have adopted the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. It's not based on the Universal Declaration, but on Sharia. However, Sharia is incompatible with the Universal Declaration on many points. As an example, on women's rights, Sharia does not provide for equal rights, but for equal dignity. That's a diversely appreciated concept.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Madam Moderator, distinguished panelists, at the outset I would like to thank all of you for your contribution and appreciate this opportunity for emphasizing the role of chastity and strengthening crime prevention to eliminate violence against women and girl children. Thank you.
In the name of modesty and Islamic law, many countries discriminate homosexuals. In 2001, 52 Egyptians were jailed for offense to religion. And recently, 2 young people aged 16 and 18, suspected of being lovers, were hanged in Iran. We have interviewed the delegate of a country which is far from being as radical as Egypt and Iran on the matter, but which seats with the same group, the Algerian ambassador. Today, being homosexual in an Arab country can send someone in prison. How is it possible to not respect the Universal Declaration on that specific matter? For us, and for everybody, for the Human Rights Council, for the United Nations, respecting human rights is respecting the conventions. And in the conventions, homosexuality and same-sex marriages are not mentioned. Thus, it is a Western-centric point of view, which is adopted in some of your countries. Good for you, but it's not a universal point of view.
Occidentalocentrique des choses qui est pratiquée dans certains de vos pays, grand bien vous fasse, mais ce n'est pas nécessairement une vision universelle.
If there's one country where Sharia is clearly inconsistent with human rights, then Mauritania has to be this country. Slavery persists here. This young woman has just been freed from her master by human rights activists. On paper, the Mauritanian state forbids slavery. In practice, it's a different kettle of fish. Until now, the Mauritanian authorities haven't taken any proceedings for proven slavery cases, despite the speeches. These human rights activists should know. A declaration based on Sharia is completely useless in his fight against slavery, which is practiced in the name of custom and religion. Sometimes we approach slaves who say that they can't disobey their master because they'd be punished by God and go to hell. When they disobey their master, they think that they disobey God. Islam doesn't promote slavery, but Islam isn't actually opposed to slavery. Islam doesn't delegitimate slavery. What do you mean? I mean that Islam doesn't forbid slavery.
L'islam n'interdit pas l'esclavage.
For men like Biram, God's law should yield to men's law. We're back at the Human Rights Council. If there is one place to denounce excision, stoning, and hangings, it should be that very place. We have an appointment with Roy Brown, an old regular of the council. His organization stands up for 5 million lay persons throughout the world, including many Muslim victims of Sharia. In order to give them weapons, Roy fights here on every word. The fight is getting tougher and tougher.
It is no longer permissible to speak negatively about Sharia law or about Islam here in the council.
You have the floor, sir. Mr. President, it is difficult to see how the Cairo Declaration can be considered complementary to the 1948 Universal Declaration. It makes no reference to the Universal Declaration.
I have to interrupt you, sir, again. We have 2 points of order from the distinguished representative of Pakistan and then from the distinguished representative of Egypt. You have the floor, distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, we are not discussing here the Islamic Sharia. It's a controversial subject to discuss it over here.
Sharia is not under discussion here, and I don't think it is a universal document that should be discussed in the Human Rights Council.
Now, even though they were claiming that human rights is based on Sharia, we weren't allowed to discuss it. So we weren't able to bring to the attention of the Council the huge discrepancy between a Sharia concept of human rights, which, for example, permits stoning women to death, and the Universal Declaration. So this is the kind of censorship that's now fallen on the Council.
One needs to be a strategist when fighting. Muslim countries have decided a trick to be able to censor people like Ray Brown. They depict any criticism of Sharia as anti-Islamic racism.
But this problem
they name it
Such
Islamophobia.
simplistic labeling. The accusation of Islamophobia is now widely used as an ad hominem weapon to silence opponents by equating any criticism of Islam with racism.
Point of order, sir. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Mr. President, every time I listen to statements by this organization, I wonder what kind of ethics they are promoting. Every statement is an incitement of hatred. Every statement is promoting hatred. What is the value added of making reference to this incident?
In 2003, a man brought unexpected support to this strategy. This man is Doudou Diène, a United Nations expert who is supposed to draw reports on racism, but he preferred to wage a campaign against the criticism of religions. It's important that the Council should call member states to go further than the law and address the deep sources of defamation of religions.
Et touche aux sources profondes de la diffamation des religions.
His reports are oddly silent on the rife anti-black racism in Arab countries or on the persecution of Muslims in China. Doudou Diène rather considers the real tormentors to be laypersons or journalists who inquire on Islamic fundamentalism. The most quoted example is the case of the 12 Danish cartoons of Muhammad. They were rather mild cartoons, only one of which denounced the use of terror in the name of Islam. His author is still under a death threat because he dared to draw it. But the Iranian delegate isn't interested in that kind of violence.
The conclusion of the Special Rapporteur that defamation of religions and Islamophobia is on the rise is alarming. The recent case of defamatory cartoon in Sweden vividly testifies to this conclusion. Islamic Republic of Iran strongly condemns the publication of the said offensive and blasphemous cartoon of the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, in a Swedish newspaper.
That says it. The OIC countries are not interested in fighting against racism, but are bent on fighting blasphemy. Muslim countries began to wage war against freedom of speech before the Danish cartoons case. Since the end of the 90s, they have been trying to have a resolution voted against defamation of religions. Pakistan is a notable leader of this movement.
The resolution is tabled in the expectation that it will compel the international community to acknowledge and address the disturbing phenomena of the defamation of religions, especially Islam.
The European Union won't accept the integration of defamation of religions in the frame of human rights.
I will invite the member states to vote now.
March 27, 2008. In blue, the 14 countries, mostly Latin American, which abstain. In red, the European countries, which vote against. In green, Russia, China, and Cuba, which aren't especially praised as friends of religious freedom, come to the Muslim countries' assistance.
Resolution L15 is therefore adopted.
The resolution is adopted 21 to 10. It doesn't look like it, but the Council has blunted the sole weapon that dissidents can use against dictatorships: freedom of speech. This resolution against defamation of religions is a real stabbing for free minds who live in religious countries. During 1 hour, the room of the council hosts Egyptian Democrats who came here to fight for freedom of speech. This young woman at the platform is a lawyer who came to speak about her client, Karim Amir. He's a 22-year-old law student who has been sentenced to 3 years in jail for insulting Islam. What was his crime? Writing a blog which was critical of the government and of Islamic fundamentalists. The Egyptian constitution is supposed to protect freedom of conscience and worship, but actually the accusation of blasphemy is mostly used to silence opponents and minorities. Recently, we've had the case of an Egyptian converted to Christianity from Islam. He has been accused of undermining Islam, and he is under a death threat from Islamic fundamentalists. And this is the other problem raised by the concept of defamation of religions. In some countries, such as Pakistan, the charge of blasphemy is used to make Islam sacred and to persecute other religions. For example, Sindh, marginal Islamic sects, Hindus, and Christians. The cult is tolerated within churches, but ostensibly displaying another belief than Islam in public may lead to the charge of blasphemy. Very recently, 2 female students who had put a picture of Jesus on the walls of their faculty have been arrested. They face a death sentence. That's paradoxical. The countries which are the most vocal against defamation of religion are also the worst when it comes to dealing with religious minorities. Pakistan, Egypt, Iran. Let's consider Iran and the Baha'i minority. Surely, you never heard of it. The Baha'i faith was born in 18th century Persia, seceding from Shiite Islam. Their places of worship and cemeteries have been destroyed. Baha'i followers have been persecuted under the Shah and are still persecuted under today's Islamic Republic. But these persecutions aren't mentioned in any report, and when a Baha'i activist wants to denounce them, she gets pulled up.
They not only incite hatred and mistrust of Baha'is among the people of Iran, but have also gradually created an atmosphere where human rights violations against members of this minority are carried out with impunity. The authorities in Iran have now added a twist to this pattern of abuse. 7 Baha'i leaders have been in prison for over 4 months with no access to legal counsel.
Madam, please. I'll give the floor to Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We think that the statement is not related to the topic in discussion.
Thank you very much. And I would like to address the Speaker. Delegates should refrain from referring to country situations. It is, however, possible to refer to situations in several countries as examples. The focus of your statement, Madam, should remain the consideration of item 9. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I'm very sorry for this problem. We had made a contribution that appears in the report under item 9 on defamation by the Secretary of the High Commissioner, and this was just an addition to that report. So we felt that this was completely in line with your ruling. However, if there's any problem, we will stop our statement. I will just conclude then. Mr. President, we call upon the international community, and particularly those governments who support initiatives on defamation of religions, to denounce these tactics that was mentioned in our report and that I referred to, and to condemn the official, systematic incitement to hatred that targets the Baha'is in Iran. Thank you, Mr. President.
Hopefully, at the Human Rights Council, not only states know how to dodge. For once, Iran didn't get the last word. This is a country which Iran and its allies always consider in an obsessional manner. Out of the 7 last special sessions of the Human Rights Council, 5 were dedicated to Israel. In December 2008, during the Gaza tragedy, the Iranian foreign minister went to the platform.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. From my own time for a speech, I would like, Mr. President, to request 1 minute silence and ask my Muslim brothers and sisters to read Fatiha for those martyrs in Gaza nowadays.
The Human Rights Council is under high tension. You understand now why some people are afraid that a new conference against racism may turn into the one too many battle. Remember, in Durban, the negotiations were carried out in an electric climate. African, Muslim, and non-allied countries, above all, demanded compensations for past discriminations, such as transatlantic slave trade and colonization. And the same countries don't necessarily want to hear about today's discriminations, such as the ones against untouchables, women, or sexual minorities. The holdup of the NGO forum by radicals has resulted in the failure of the negotiations. Israel and the United States then left the conference. The EU, then presided over by Belgium, decided to stay and tried to save the Declaration Against Racism. It was tough, it was complicated, but our vision was to stay until the end instead of leaving and letting the situation degenerate. We thought that we could stay until the end, and that by holding our positions, by stating clearly that there was unacceptable language, by saying that the conference needed to focus on the fight against racism, we'd reach a result. I'm personally proud of this result, which is a very good base for the struggle against racism in general in the world. It was worth the effort. Were these efforts warranted? In order to judge, we have reread carefully this declaration. Actually, most of the text adopted in Durban gives weapons to the victims of racism, slavery, religious persecution, and anti-Semitism. One paragraph insists on the memory of the Shoah. But as a trade-off, the European Union has had to make two major concessions. First, the introduction of the ambiguous concept of Islamophobia. Second, a focus on Israel, which is the only country to be quoted. This off-the-subject obsession has obscured two discriminations: against the untouchables in India and against homosexuals in Muslim countries. Nine years later, the United Nations are getting ready to negotiate this declaration again during a new conference against racism held in Geneva. Canada and the United States, which fear escalation, won't attend the conference. The European Union will stay at the negotiations, but it has laid down its conditions. In March 2008, Ramayad, the French Secretary of State for Human Rights, spoke at the platform. We must address all forms of racism, for no societies of ours is free from this plague. We won't fight this plague effectively by fighting each other or focusing on a partial approach. The regrettable drifts and the outrages of the Durban Conference must not happen again.
Nous lutterons efficacement contre ce mal. Les dérives et les outrances qui ont entouré la conférence de Durban ne doivent pas se répéter.
We have defined a number of red lines. There are things that we won't accept. We won't accept it if it turns into an exercise of anti-Semitism, an attempt of systematic criticism of Israel, an attempt to restrain freedom of speech in the name of religion. Thus, it's a conditional participation, but in good faith.
Ce sont autant de choses qu'on ne pourra pas accepter. Donc c'est une participation conditionnelle, mais encore une fois, de bonne foi.
For now, the good faith and the firmness of Europeans seems to have good results, but the bitterness of preparatory negotiations shows clearly that the game isn't over yet, especially when it comes to the defamation of religions. After the resolution was voted by the Council, Islamic countries have insisted to integrate the defamation of religions in the Anti-Racism Declaration, and the European Union won't accept that. We fully understand the concerns of Muslim countries that have been voiced today, but some things are simply unacceptable for us. And defamation of religions is one of these unacceptable things.
Let me say once for all, I, in my capacity as coordinator, have said it time and again, and I do not know why people read more than what is being stated. Defamation has no link to freedom of expression. It has link to the abuse of this freedom.
What can be done? Should democracies stay in this arena, facing the risk of losing a few battles, or should they leave? With the risk of having their adversaries tear down to pieces the Universal Declaration, which has miraculously been used as a common language between nations. At this time for choice, a new wind is blowing in Geneva. The face of America has changed. The U.S. consider coming back in the Council. For those who hope to give voice to democracies, this is not the time to hide. If the choice is between a universal body with all the associated difficulties and staying between democracies in a small club, then very clearly we must opt for the universal body. What would be the use of a club of democracies? We cheer ourselves and human rights wouldn't progress. Thus, we must work within a universal frame, even if it's complicated, even if it's difficult. Despite all its faults, the Council is a unique place in the world. It's the only place where human rights activists can challenge dictatorships. Doing away with it wouldn't end their crimes. The Human Rights Council is only a reflection of the state of the world. Want can cure evil by deleting its reflection.